Thank you everyone for coming here today. It is such a joy to be here to mark the 700th anniversary. I mean, as much as this is a very solemn occasion on one level, but also to recognize what happened and how we can learn from our history so we don't keep repeating tragic mistakes. And I want to thank so many people, especially Regina Fitzpatrick, who has been instrumental in organizing things behind the scenes, as well as Pat and Anne and everyone. So thanks so much. And also to be here before Bernadette Williams is such an honor. This is actually my first book, The Templars, the Witch and the Wild Irish. And Bernadette was tremendously helpful to me when I was a graduate student, getting to better understand this history. So, let's see. So I want to just share, first, if anyone from Cartoon Saloon is here, I think the graphic is fantastic. I normally do not like images of burning women. The cover of my first book, which is from Temple House in Sligo, I loved the way that the tree sort of looked as if it could be someone at the stake, but it was also about nature reclaiming the history in different ways. That copy is actually promised. It's the last copy that I brought here, right? I believe you were the person to whom it is promised, right? So I sold out the copies. I was speaking at the cathedral on Thursday, and all the copies I brought with me are gone. And Four Courts in Ireland is not, it is one of the presses, but it doesn't carry them here anymore. So if you're interested in buying the book, you can get it as an ebook through Cornell University Press. Okay, so where I take my title from is actually from something that John Klyn, who we've heard about, says about this case. And he says, prior to Petronilla, from the days of yore, it had not been seen nor heard in Ireland that someone should suffer the death penalty for heresy. She was the first to be so executed according to the memory and account of all then living, not I say because she was the first to sin in such fashion, but because she was the first to suffer the just judgment of death for heresy. And I want to point out one of the things that Bernadette pointed out last night, that Klyn, even though they were both Franciscans, Klyn evidently didn't have the highest opinion of Ledrede, but he is clearly just fine with what happened to Petronilla. To look at the entirety of the quote, it says here, let's see, I'm not sure where my second one went, but in that same year, so this is the whole reference in Klyn, in that same year, namely 1324, on Monday, the Feast of the Martyrs, Processus and Martinian, which is the 2nd of July, on account of diverse sorceries, various heresies, and making burnt sacrifices to demons, Lady Alice Kyteler was judged, tried, and condemned a heretic by Brother Richard, Bishop of Ossory. Those present and witnessing this were Lord John Darcy, the Justiciar of Ireland, Roger Outlaw, the Prior of Kilmainham, who's also kin to Alice's first husband at some level, and Chancellor of Ireland, Walter Islip, the Treasurer of Ireland, and Arnold Le Poer, the Seneschal of Kilkenny, who is kin to her current husband. And it also has to be noted, these two men, Roger Outlaw and Arnold Le Poer, were her fiercest defenders, apart from William Outlaw, who was her son. So just to know that even though Ledrede was accusing her of killing her husbands, their kinsmen were not persuaded by this logic. And then he continues, also on the day after the Feast of All Souls, so that would be tomorrow, because today is All Souls, in that same year, a certain woman, Petronilla di Midia, said to be of the sect and doctrine of the aforesaid Lady Alice, referenced above, was condemned for heresy, sorcery, and making burnt offerings to demons, and was delivered to the fire and burned alive. It was neither seen nor heard from times past that anybody had endured the death penalty for heresy in Ireland before her. And then he continues to the part that we've already looked at. So the main sources of information that we have for the Kilkenny witch trial are the narrative of the proceedings against Dame Alice Kyteler, which is heavily biased in Ledrede's favor and was likely written by him. There was a reference earlier about writing the memoir of Ledrede. I think Ledrede actually beat people to it in 1327 or thereabouts when he was writing his version of what happened in this case. And then we have the Annals of John Klyn, which were written about a decade later, starting about a decade later, and up until 1349, when it seems likely that he himself died from the plague. We also have the Annals of Dublin Dominican John Pembridge, who was the head of the Dominican order in Ireland from 1331 to 1343, who wrote around the same time as Klyn, and very soon we'll have the complete, or nearly complete, 2/3 anyway, of Pembridge's annals. We're very excited about that. Our earlier information about Petronilla, and I'm so pleased in particular to be able to center Petronilla because there's a lot of attention on Alice. There's a lot of attention on Robert, but there's not a lot of attention on Petronilla, and she is the one who was murdered alive. So we have almost nothing is known of her earlier. Di Midia literally means of me, but it was a well-established family name, particularly in the Cork area, but we don't know much about her personally. And we know also that her husband had died by 1316, so she was a widow at this time. So the first time we see Petronilla's name appearing is in the narrative about a writ for arrest on the 6th of June. And this is where we see 12 total people having their arrest requested. We've already seen Alice and William outlaw. Ledrede has already gone after them, but this is the first time we see these 10 other people. And this is the order in which they appear. So you first have Alice Kyteler, mother of William Outlaw. Then you have William Outlaw, her son, Robert of Bristol, the cleric, John Gelrusin, William Payne de Boley, Petronilla di Midia and her daughter, Sarah, Alice, the wife of Henry Faber, Anota Lang, Alina Gelrusin, and Sisik Gelrusin, although Anthony is going to tell me that Sisik is really something like Cecilia, but I'm fond of Sisik, and Eva Brownstone. So these are all the people who were accused with Alice, ultimately. Okay. What any of these people had to do with Alice or William or why they were so accused, we have no idea. Pembridge is the Dublin Dominican who's writing a little bit later. He adds that Petronilla's daughter Basilia fled Ireland with Alice Kyteler. He doesn't explain as to the dynamics, if this is like a hostage situation or if this was an act of sisterly solidarity. And also he gives a different name, Basilia. It's clear, though, that he presumably meant the woman or the female known as Sarah. Pembridge wrote about 9 years after these events, and he misrepresented several things, some of which we heard about last night. One of the things I want to just clarify a little bit or spend a little time on is about how Petronilla is often called Alice's maid. But this is not in the 14th century sources, and I think it's really important to look at what the sources do say and don't say in the 14th century. And I think there's some confusion about some of the things that they do say that makes people draw the conclusion that she was her maid. And plus, it's a compelling narrative to see the rich woman gets away while her maid is the one who burns at the stake. There's one reference in the 6th charge and another in the 3rd. There are 7 total charges that were brought against Alice and her alleged accomplices. 6 of them almost certainly result from the torture-induced confession of Petronilla di Midia. But the 6th charge, the one exception to those 7 charges, is almost certainly the original basis for the trial. And it's when Alice's stepchildren alleged, as we'll see in a minute what exactly they allege. But I do also want to note that the only stepson we know who specifically brought any claims against Alice was Richard de Val, who's the son of her 3rd known husband, who Alice had to sue for her widow's dower in 1316, the year before Ledrede arrived as Bishop of Ossory. So this is the allegation made by her stepchildren. By her sorcery, she had killed some of their fathers. Some she had infatuated and driven to such stupidity of sense that they gave all their property to her and her son, to the perpetual impoverishment of their children and heirs. I do want to note this does align with what happened with husband number 2, Adam LeBlund, who did quitclaim all his property to Alice's son, William, and then 2 years later, she was already married to husband number 3. So it's a little suspicious, I grant. And it also alleges the 6th charge that her current husband, the knight John Lepoer, was quickly approaching his untimely death due to her magical potions as well. The 6th charge continues that with the help of one of Alice's maids, John wrested the keys to her chest from her, and upon opening them found a sack of abominable ingredients, which he promptly had delivered to the bishop. So there is this reference to the maid, but there is no suggestion that Petronilla is that maid. And if Petronilla had been intended, presumably it would have been spelled out. Continuing with Petronilla's confession and Ledrede's charges, Petronilla declared that at Alice's instigation, quote, she had denied her faith in Christ and the church completely. a claim that was surprisingly reduced in the charges ultimately brought against Alice and her accomplices. So we've got first what Petronilla confesses to after she's been tortured repeatedly. And then we have the charges. The first charge states that the culprits denied their faith in Christ and his church for a month or a year, depending on the needs of their sorcery. Petronilla also admitted to sacrificing to demons thrice on Alice's behalf, at least once with 3 cocks at the crossroads, outside the city to Robert, son of Art, and it's really like from the slums of hell. He doesn't just come from hell, he just comes from like the worst parts of hell. And this is in the second charge as well. Petronilla then said she poured out the cock's blood, chopped up the carcasses, and combined the intestines with insects and herbs, which she boiled in a pot with the brains and clothes of an unbaptized boy, as well as the head of a robber. In addition to this foul brew, she had made many brews, potions, and powders which were used to inspire love or hatred and to generally harass good Christians. By adding incantation to these concoctions, she could make certain women's faces appear like horned goats. And this is basically what Ledrede alleges in the 5th charge. Petronilla also says she has consulted demons and received answers at Alice's prompting and once in her presence. She also said she had made a pact to serve as a kind of go-between Alice and her demon lover, Robert. She also publicly maintained that she had seen Robert take the form of 3 Ethiopian men, each carrying an iron stick in their hands in broad daylight. And then while Petronilla watched, Alice and Robert had sex, and Petronilla subsequently cleaned up after them. So this is another reference to her doing something maid-like, right? She's not identified as the maid, and given the circumstances, you're going to go with the sex with the demon lover as well for the maid. But clearly, Petronilla is presenting herself very much as Alice's follower, her servant. She'll do, she's serving her not in a professional capacity like a maid, but just she'll do whatever Alice is asking, basically, because she's been tortured into saying this. Ledrede doesn't mention this last detail about cleaning up in the 7th charge against Alice, but he otherwise expands upon Petronilla's testimony. He claimed that Alice herself had admitted that in exchange for her submission and sexual services, she received the entirety of her very considerable estate from her incubus, Robert or Robin, son of Art, who might come to her as a cat, a hairy black dog, or a black man with 2 big friends, one of them holding an iron rod. And I want to emphasize, Alice was never caught by Ledrede. Alice never confessed to anything that Ledrede said. So when he's saying Alice says this, again, no evidence to support that. And what evidence we do have shows that she did not confess to any such thing. Okay, so then we get to the last element in Petronilla's confession, which to me is one of the most fascinating parts of the case, that she and Alice often uttered curses against their husbands by lighting wax candles and spitting exactly as their rite required. Petronilla identified herself as the magistra, or the leader. This is the same word in the masculine as master in this ritual, but she maintained that she was nothing compared to Alice, from whom she had learned all, and whom she described as the most skilled witch, quote, in all the realm of the King of England, which at this time included Kilkenny, and possibly in the world. So this is Petronilla's confession that gets turned into the 4th charge. In their nightly conventicles, and this is interesting because remember there are 4 men accused along with 8 women, but this charge is totally focusing on the women. They usurped the jurisdiction and keys of the church when with waxen candles burning they would fulminate sentences of excommunication even against their own husbands, naming one by one every part of their body from the soles of their feet to the top of their head. And in the end they would extinguish the candles as they said, fiat, 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 which is basically make it so, let it happen. Amen. And it's interesting, so you see here, priests are the ones, bishops are the ones who have the right to excommunicate people, not wives doing that to their husbands. So you can see they are usurping powers they're not supposed to have. So when we get to, after the reference to her arrest with the 11 others, the next time Petronilla shows up in the narrative is in connection with her execution on the 3rd of November, which the text combines the description of her execution with a summary of her confession. And it's important to acknowledge that the narrative only includes this one confession. So Petronilla is the only one to have actually confessed. The narrative also says that she was fustigata, which is being flogged or whipped, or it probably references pretty severe torture, and this happened 6 times until she finally confessed to what he wanted her to say. It also notes that Petronilla refused the sacrament of penance. It's not clear if this is his way of saying, see how badly she rejected the church, even in the final hour she wouldn't repent, or if she just was done with Ledrede and everything he represented, and she wanted no more part of it. And then Pembridge, the Dublin Dominican, adds that when she was close to death, she said that William Outlaw deserved death just as much as she did, and she also asserted that he wore a diabolical belt around his naked body for a year and a day. One of the things that Pembridge pins on Petronilla is William Outlaw's arrest, because he says it followed her execution, but really we know he was already in prison before that. So the narrative says that Petronilla, quote, was the first heretical sorceress among a great many ever burned in Ireland, which I find very ominous. I think that speaks to what he intended to do later on, if he had met his goal of becoming the Inquisitor of Ireland, as he intended to do. But he does not acknowledge any who met a similar end. In its conclusion, the narrative describes various fates met by other heretics and sorcerers of the pestiferous sect of Robin, son of Art, including death at the stake, public confession, and abjuration of heresy, with the front and the back of the clothes being marked by a cross, quote, as the custom is, but there's no reference to this custom happening in Ireland at this time, so he might be thinking of France. Whippings through the town and marketplace, exile, and excommunication. And others fled Ledrede's persecution, including Alice Kyteler. But he's the only one who's telling us more of these details, but we can't verify anything. And it seems almost certain that Petronilla was actually the only one of these great heretical sorcerers who was burned at the stake, as other 14th century sources only mention her execution. So this is a very important trial in the history of witchcraft and religious persecution, and not just in the context of Ireland. So some of the things that it is the first time we see is as I call this, is the dawn of the devil-worshipping witch, when you merge the witch with the heretic. The church was already very skilled, I don't know if that's the right word, but they had developed a lot of how do you go after heretics in pretty significant ways, and Ledrede merged that with prosecution of witchcraft, and he merged an accusation against a witch with an accusation of heresy. It's also the first time in the history of the persecution or prosecution of witchcraft that we see the combination of sorcery and natural magic with demonic magic. It's the first time in European history that people accused of witchcraft were presented as an organized heretical sect. It's the first time we see fornication mentioned in the demonic pact, although it is important to note that the sex between demon and witch was still separate from the witch's Sabbath. Petronilla is said to watch, but Alice and Robert are portrayed as having a monogamous relationship, and they only had sex during the day. It's very clear they're not doing it at night. So the description of the witches' nocturnal meetings when they're excommunicating their husband doesn't include charges of sexual impropriety apart from the excommunication of their husbands. Some scholars will add an orgy to the nightly rites. This is something we will see later develop in the persecution of witchcraft, but it's not something that appears in the narrative or other 14th century references to the case. So the next references to witchcraft in Ireland, as was mentioned by the bishop a little bit earlier, we hear in 1447 that they swear, quote, no such art was attempted at any time in this land. So it seems like the Kyteler case was already forgotten by 1447. We do see various instances of witch accusations being used as a slur over the next several centuries, including shortly before the Tudor Reformation, when a woman brought a charge of defamation at the consistory court of the Archdiocese of Armagh for being called a sorcerer. There was another witch who was sent to the Lord Deputy to be examined in 1544, but Ireland didn't see another death for witchcraft until 1578, which also happened here in Kilkenny. I don't know what's going on here in Kilkenny, and it seems to have been a lot of people were killed, 36 people, which included, quote, a blackamoor and 2 witches. Apparently none of its other half-dozen witch trials claimed lives. The trials, that doesn't mean people weren't killed as witches, but I'm talking about the trials, with the possible exception of Florence Newton of Youghal in 1661. We also see somebody who sounds a little like Ledrede, Griffith Williams, the aged and infirm Bishop of Ossory, who believed that Captain Thomas Evans was bewitching him. But the Archbishop of Dublin, again we see this feud between the Archbishop of Dublin and the Bishop of Ossory, he expressed concerns about the harm that, quote, the dotage or frenzy, end quote, of the aged, troublesome, and combative bishop posed to his diocese, and he wished to replace him, which is very similar to something we see Edward III say about Ledrede in the very final years of Ledrede's life. In 1698, a mob murdered an old woman who was accused of bewitching a young girl in Antrim, and they strangled and burned her. And actually, in this case, if they had followed the Witchcraft Act, she wouldn't have been killed. Sometimes the mob is much more fearsome than the authorities. One of the most famous cases in Islandmagee in 1711 found 8 women and 1 man guilty of witchcraft, and they were imprisoned for a year. So one of the things that's so striking about the Kyteler case is it's so remarkable. It provides a prototype for the witch trials that we're going to see later, but really it's over a century earlier than these other witch trials. And these other witch trials, like I've gone over the other references to witch trials in Ireland, you don't see a lot, and you don't see anything close to, I mean, maybe whatever happened in 1578. But generally speaking, Ireland was not as affected by witchcraft persecution as other parts of Christendom, or Western Christendom in particular. So this is a table that takes what data we have from the witch trials, and it shows, I mean, things were still bad in the period from 1300 to 1420, so this is Europe more broadly speaking. But you see a marked increase after 1420, where you have 63% of the trials that involved women resulted in killing the women who were accused of witchcraft, and 25% with women being punished, and only 12% with no punishment. Men were killed. Now, there's 77% of the men who were part of a witch trial were killed, which is much higher than the 63%, but you also have to note less than 50%. They had 50 men total as opposed to 112. So far more women would be accused of witchcraft, but if a man got accused of witchcraft, it was a lot more dangerous for him. If it succeeded to the point of trial, he's, much more likely to be executed. So to consider more broadly, the witch hunt, which is a problematic term, but it works. So generally, people would date the witch hunts to 1450 to 1750. I would say a conservative estimate of the number of people killed is about 50,000 people during this time period. 75% to 80% of them were women or females. In England and Denmark, you would have over 90% being females. Scotland, you had 84% women, 15% men, and 1% not known. But you also had places like Iceland, where it had vast gender discrepancies against men, as far as men being much more likely to be accused and executed. So I'm going to switch now to the New World, and in particular to Salem, connecting these witch trials and what we can learn from them for today. And just as somebody who focuses on medieval Europe, I'm very envious of Americanists who have so much more of a complete record to look at. And I'm drawing primarily from the work of Carol Carlson's The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. There are other books about the Salem witch trials, but this is really the best book, and especially for the gender ramifications of the situation. So among the things she says is the story of witchcraft is primarily the story of women. One of the things that some people say who study witchcraft, show me a witch and you'll show me what you think about women. Different ways, so to think about that connection. It confronts us with ideas about women, fears about women, the place of women in society, and with women themselves, and it also confronts us with systematic violence against women. So just in Salem, in a few months, in 1692, almost 200 people were accused. Of the 185 that were identifiable by sex, more than 3/4 were female. Nearly 50% of the males were husbands, sons, or other male kin of the accused. So when you have an accused female in your family as a male, you are much more susceptible to accusations being made against you as well. 22 women and 5 men were tried and convicted before the governor called a halt in October 1692 after his own wife was accused. And if his wife is accused, That means it increases the likelihood that he himself will be accused. And 14 women and 5 men, including a former minister, George Burroughs, had already been hanged by that point. Giles Corey had been pressed to death because he refused to respond to the accusation. Basically, he refused to say he was either guilty or innocent. He wouldn't even recognize what they were saying. And there were several women and men as well who died in prison awaiting trial. If you confessed, you generally got released. If you refused to confess, you were more likely to get convicted and then get executed. Okay? And this is something also that we see with the Templars, the trial of the Templars in France too, so it's important to acknowledge. Overall, from 1620 to 1725, we know of at least 344 people who were accused of witchcraft. Of those whose sex can be identified, 78% were female. Nearly half of the 75 males accused were suspect by association. Again, they have female kin who have been accused of witchcraft. During outbreaks, which is time of intense witch persecution, like something like Salem, and we saw something similar happening in Hartford, Connecticut in 1662, the gender ratio of the accused was slightly more balanced, but it was still overwhelmingly female. And of the 150 accused during non-outbreaks, 83% were female. So during outbreaks, during times of intense persecution, it opened up so that even the governor's wife could be accused. So we see far more men being accused during outbreaks. So during non-outbreaks, 83% were female, but 15 of the 16 convicted during that time were women. And the only man to be found guilty was a man from Wethersfield, Connecticut, which is my hometown of kind, Carpenter, who was hanged along with his wife in 1651. So during outbreaks, women were over twice as likely to be tried once they were accused, even given the higher disproportion of women among the accused. So we have 37% of the women accused were tried, but only 8% of the 49 men accused. Once they were tried, however, men were in far greater danger of being convicted and executed. 6 of the 8 men who were tried were found guilty and hanged. And 4 of those 6 were related to female witches, again, accused witches, convicted witches though. And 1 was a newcomer to Salem, and the other was a minister who had left and there was bad blood in his wake. 6 of the 7 men who were executed for witchcraft in New England died during outbreaks, 5 of those in Salem. And again, the only exception there is the Wethersfield carpenter, John Carrington. Of the 267 females known to have been accused of witchcraft in New England, 156 can be identified by approximate age, and an additional 48 can be described as under 40, over 40, or over 60. 58% of accused witches were over 40, but only 37% are known to have been over 60, so the age between 40 and 60 is particularly susceptible to such accusations. Only 25% of accused women under 40 faced trial, and 66 of them were named during the Salem outbreak. Women under 40 were analogous to male kin of female witches in that because they had older females who were accused, they were more susceptible to similar accusations themselves. So, and this is again, during outbreaks, they were particularly vulnerable. Of the under 40 group, only 3 women, 2 of whom who were very close to 40, seem to have been the main targets of accusation in 1692. Women over 40 were consistently more vulnerable to accusation, and they fared much worse once charged. Almost 40% of the older accused witches were brought to trial, and well over half of those tried were convicted. So the main targets of witchcraft were over 40, when they had reached the point in their lives when they were no longer performing what Puritans considered to be the major role of women, which is bearing children, and they were less likely to be actively caring for children, so they had outlived their primary purpose as far as this was concerned. So looking at the data, we can see that witches were likely to be the daughters of parents who had no sons or whose sons had died, women in marriages which had only daughters or in which sons had died, women in marriages with no children at all. So there were no male heirs, so these women inherited their family estates, or what property they were, or they were supposed to inherit it, and somebody did something so depriving them of their money, like Richard Duval tried to deprive Alice Kyteler of her widow's dower. So as Carlson says, these women were aberrations in a society with an inheritance system designed to keep property in the hands of men. Once accused, women without brothers or sons were even more likely to be tried, convicted, and executed. Women from families without male heirs made up 64% of the females prosecuted, 76% of those who were found guilty, and 89% of those executed. So you see a very clear correlation between women who should at least have inherited property being accused of witchcraft. 18 of the 62 women who had brothers or sons were themselves daughters and granddaughters of women who did not. And they may have been first accused because they believed these older women had passed on their witchcraft and their property to them. In Puritans' views, inferiors served God by serving their superiors, and women needed to be wives even more than mothers. As Carlson says, from the beginning the message was clear: women who failed to serve men failed to serve God. To be numbered among God's elect, women had to acknowledge this service as their calling and believe they were created for this purpose. And as she says, I think this is really powerful, the fear of independent women lay at the heart of New England's nightmare. One of the things that's so fascinating about Salem are the possessed accusers. I'm sure you've heard of the story of the young girls who then become demonically possessed, and you see this also similarly in, or at least parts of it in Islandmagee. And 67 of the 78, so 86% of these accusers were female. And it says a lot about social conditioning and gender conditioning and how they could see the temptation to witchcraft in themselves. Almost all of these women were single, or they were unmarried girls or unmarried women. And many of them had also been orphaned, with parents killed in native attacks from indigenous Americans. Sometimes right in front of them, sometimes they had been witnesses to their parents' execution, so obviously they were traumatized, and they were also then orphans. They did not have the family protection behind them. They no longer had, even if their families had had some money, they no longer had access to this money, and they had to come down to distant relatives in Massachusetts. And in order to survive, many of them were servants, which made them particularly susceptible to abuses of power, and how those female servants would generally be the ones blamed for those abuses of power. And so you can see, again, a possible correlation there with the role Petronilla played. Again, quoting Carlson, as the community looked on, their bodies expressed, because they're supposed to be possessed in different ways, what otherwise they could not, that the enormous pressures put upon them to accept a religiously based, male-centered social order was more than they could bear. To accept the community's truth was to deny the self. To assert the truth was to suffer the response of a threatened community. Given this choice, they chose a world of their own, which is possession. And this is obviously no real escape, since they either could be godly or they could be witches. Demonic possession didn't work so well. I want to point out, though, one of the things that I think is good to learn from Salem is how quickly many of them recognized we made a mistake. We acted in an irresponsible way. And in 1697, so that's just 5 years later, they held a day of fasting and prayer to atone for the sins of the colony, which included explicitly the witchcraft trials. And one of the judges and several of the jurors apologized for their own roles in contributing to this. This long paragraph is basically showing how all of the accused, or all of those convicted, have been since exonerated, since pardoned. And lastly, in 2022, when there was one person who hadn't yet, due to oversight, and it was really a middle school project that enabled that last accused woman to have her name cleared. In the past, especially 20 years or so, 15 years or so, we've seen an increasing number of places in Europe recognizing how wrong it was for these persecutions to happen. This is a lovely, I haven't been there myself, but this is a lovely memorial to the 91 people killed for witchcraft in 1621 in Norway, and 77 of those 91 were women. To note that just 2.5 years ago, Nicola Sturgeon apologized to the people, and especially the women, who were executed for witchcraft in Scotland. And she did so on International Women's Day, and pointing out that, in some sense, as under the colossal scale paragraphs, that they were killed because they were poor, different, vulnerable, or in many cases just because they were women. So the role of gender in this persecution. We saw just a little over 15 years ago that In Switzerland, you have a similar case of a servant woman who is supposedly having an affair with her employer and said to be possessing his daughter, who was executed in 1782. She's pardoned in 2008. Catalonia recently also apologized for what gets called institutionalized femicide by the Catalan president at the time. That's from 2022, so again, quite recently, that people are recognizing and they feel obligated to do something to try to learn from the past. This is an interesting article by a scholar that is saying the need to have more pardons for witches, because to recognize that this isn't this kind of persecution of people who are accused of witchcraft isn't just part of the past. According to a 2020 UN report, that at least 20,000 witches were killed across 60 countries just between 2009 and 2019. So it's not just in the past, it's not just a medieval thing. And as a medievalist, I want to point out the witch persecutions are really much more an early modern thing than they are a medieval thing. Again, the Kyteler case is over 100 years earlier than most other cases. You also have some men like Donald Trump and others who like to claim themselves as being the victims of a witch hunt when they get called out for their predatory actions, especially against women. So you have another scholar who is pointing out about how this is harmful when powerful men who are being predators are trying to make themselves the victims of, quote, witch hunts. You have Lindy West's particular take. This is on, what's his name, the movie producer? Weinstein, right, that one. There's so many. I mean, how can you, but you knew who I was talking about. So, and other men like Woody Allen banding together and saying that this, the Me Too movement essentially is a witch hunt. And Lindy West says, yes, this is a witch hunt. I'm a witch and I'm hunting you. So, this is a poem that I regularly think of in my research because I center religious persecution. And these are, I mean, they're interesting, it's fascinating, but there's also people being tortured and people being killed. And to acknowledge this really powerful poem that Margaret Atwood wrote about how these horrors that go on this did not just happen last year or 40 years ago, or I added, or 700 years ago. These kinds of victimization of the vulnerable and the marginalized and the powerless is something that happens every single day. And we need to learn from our past so we can do better for our future. And the last, and the part that I've quoted anyway, this line to me is so powerful. Witness is what you must bear. You can't just walk on by. You have to really hold yourself accountable. And also to note that the word martyr itself means one who bears witness. This is a reference to the Islandmagee case, which this is just from last year. And I have to say, as a historian of witchcraft, it's interesting to me that it seems like the Islandmagee case gets a lot more attention than the Kyteler case, and I don't know if that's true for people in Ireland, but it's the way I feel looking from the outside into Ireland. And the Kyteler case is so much more historically significant in so many different ways. So, and I don't know Councillor Maeve Donnelly, and it's nothing about her in particular, but in this BBC clip about it, she says, they were innocent, they weren't witches. And I want to emphasize it's not either or, it's both and. You're not either innocent or you're a witch. You can be both innocent and a witch. And to consider how we look at the past and whether or not we say it's okay to do this to people if there are scapegoats for various things. So this leads to something that I regularly wrestle with in my work in general, but also especially with regards to Petronilla. And part of the reason why I'm so pleased to be able to center Petronilla today, to consider the question, who are our others? So, I think there's a slide missing. Oh, here we go. All right, I don't want to get there yet. So, but it's still the same idea, justice for the Petronillas of today. To point out that the word magic, if those of you who were at my talk on Thursday heard me reference that, but the word magic actually comes from the Greek word for Persian priest. And if you know your history about the Greeks and the Persians, they hated each other. But the Greeks get to tell the history in many ways. So the term, when it's a Persian priest, is the priest of the other. It's something suspect, it's something sinister, it's something, a perversion of religion. We do genuine religion, but they, the other, they do magic. To note that no matter who we are, in all sorts of ways, we divide into us and them. There's a fascinating theory about religion, and I am a professor of religion in particular. This theory by Joshua Green, who's a Harvard moral psychologist. What he argues that, now keep in mind he's centering morality and moral psychology, but he says that way back in the dawn of time, which nobody can go back to, but when humanity made the evolutionary leap from working individually to collaborating and creating communities, that humans were basically too selfish, too individually oriented. So we had to get people to think in terms of we instead of in terms of me. But when humans started thinking in terms of we instead of me, they also thought in terms of us as opposed to many other thems. And the thems are considered less human, and you can do certain things to the thems that you couldn't do to us. And just to reflect that the more power we as individuals or our group, whatever our group might be, whatever power we might have, the more problematic this tendency of dividing into us and them is. This is a little meme from maybe, I think, around 2015 with the caption, if she drowns, she's a refugee. If she floats, she's an economic migrant. Because there was this debate, do we allow refugees in? And people who were opposed to it would say they're not refugees, they're economic migrants, and they should have less sympathy and consideration than a refugee. And it is, of course, is she a witch? And this is the trial by ordeal, that you would put her in the water, and if she drowned, well, then she was innocent. I mean, she was also dead, but she was innocent. But if the water rejected her, then she was a witch, and then you could finish the job that the water. So to consider the question, who are others, and not just to consider witches or refugees and migrants, and definitely not powerful men who exploit and abuse the less powerful, and they cry a witch hunt when they're called out for it. I'm particularly interested in what Ronald Hutton, who's a scholar of folklore and medieval culture, in his book, The Witch, A History of Fear from Ancient Times to the Present, he quotes the established scholarly consensus definition of a witch from Rodney Needham in 1978 as someone who causes harm to others by mystical means. So this is when people use the word witch, this is often what they understand it to be. And just note, we don't know what witch really means in its origin. There's a lot of people who think that it comes from like the same root word that wit does, or skill or knowledge or something like that, but we don't know for sure. And so Hutton is looking at 4 equally valid current Anglo-American, I'm sure he means to include the Irish in that as well. He's an Englishman, who knows. And he says Needham's is the most dominant, this idea that someone who causes harm to others by mystical means. But the other 3 are anyone who practices magic, and it's not necessarily good or bad magic, a practitioner of pagan religion dedicated to the forces of nature, and a symbol of independent female authority and resistance to male domination, making it an expression of individual self-realization and liberation, especially for women. And I want to call attention to these latter 2 in particular, because I think this is very much at the heart of a lot of witch persecution throughout history, is that these were powerful women. There were women who often had degrees of authority or wealth that the systems that be, including patriarchal systems, were not comfortable with. And to note also that this connection between witches and nature, but also between women and nature generally. There's a very important essay by Sherry Ortner from 1972, which the title of it is Female is to Nature as Male is to Culture, and to understand that women in particular are seen as nature-oriented in different ways and more in tune with nature, whereas men are seen more as in control of civilization, and that civilization needs to tame nature in some way, and that nature is suspect and savage in different ways. An anthropologist, Peggy Reeves Sandé, builds or also elaborates on something like this, which talks about inner orientation and outer orientation societies. And inner orientations have a very positive relationship with nature. They are able to get what they need and work with more harmoniously with the earth and with the elements in different ways. And then you have outer orientation that sees nature as an enemy that needs to be controlled and tamed, and they tend to develop militaries and warrior power, and then those outer orientations will attack and colonize the inner orientations. Also to note that the term pagan, which a lot of people have embraced of late, comes from the Latin term paganus, which literally means a country dweller, and it was generally something that was applied to people who would not consider themselves that. So Christianity was especially popular in cities, and people out in the countryside tended to keep alive the old customs more, and they were seen as suspect for doing so. But pagans today have embraced the term, and especially that it's a nature-oriented religion. And this is the cover of Hutton's book. And this over here, "We are the descendants of the witches you could not burn," is a popular pagan slogan. I think it's a little problematic because some really good people were burned too, and it's not their fault that they were burned. But you can see the embrace of the trees and nature, and this is, going back to the pre-Christian religions of Europe in particular. Pagans like to do this. And I'm calling attention to this too because I think there is a strong connection between people and earth. Obviously, we need the earth to survive, and we're not treating the earth the way we need to if we want to survive. And just to note some of these things about what we're doing to climate change and how we're affecting climate change and how we're wiping out so many different species, and how we literally, this is an actual picture, this is not AI, it's people playing golf as the mountain burned behind them in Oregon in 2017. And just to recognize, the more we try to exploit nature and think we can control nature, the more we're going to see things like that. And that's, I think, for the sake of us all, we need to learn to live in greater harmony. So to give one final shout out to Petronilla to rest in power, and thank you all for your attention.